Welcome to the National 2014 Budget Edition 2014 Item Committee on the Committee. For government, we have KDU B, APU A, Malaysian Government, we have
Mr. Speaker, we think the Malaysian government is being extremely inconsiderate when it comes to acknowledging that the people have not enough spending power in status quo and they're further worsening and exacerbating the problem that is already present in status quo. What do we stand for? In opening government, we stand for, we defend the people and the fact that these people are going to be further harmed with the implementation of GST, given that their spending power is likely to decrease and by extension the cost of living. Firstly, our burden in opening government is to prove to you ultimately that GST is more harmful to the people than the benefits of GST. We're going to prove to you that after my speech and after Kelvin's speech, you will understand and you will know that GST doesn't benefit anyone in the country, and even if it does, we tell you it harms the people, the most important part of the country, that is, and the most vulnerable part of the country in the end. Okay, the first idea, right, on how this directly harms the people. We tell you firstly that this is going to affect the supply chain and not merely the end user, which is the case in SST, which is the case that the Malaysian government is using to promote GST, saying that it removes the 10% sales and service charge. This sales and service charge, Madam Chair, only affects the end user. This means that only the end user pays 10%. But under the GST, what is happening is that all across the line of production, across all levels of across all levels of production, the people are being paid 6%. The people have to pay 6% of this charge to the government. What this means is in a procedure where, say, manufacturing products, from the process of extracting the good itself, say rubber, for example, in the end to make tires, across every level of production, 6% of the value will have to be paid to the Malaysian government. What this means is there's an unfair burden on the consumer because the price of goods is certain to increase by a rapid amount despite the Malaysian government's insistence that it will not do so. This is just, Okay, second, but also we tell you, right, what this means, what are the harms of the price increasing, right? Firstly, we tell you that the cost of living in Malaysia, given the low salaries, is already poor. And the Malaysian government has done little to nothing about it. What have they done, Mr. Speaker? They have reduced income tax by 1%. They claim that 300,000 people will not need to pay income tax anymore with this. But what really is the problem? And this is where I go to the second level analysis, right? We tell you this. Given the countermeasure that the Malaysian government has introduced in the form of BRIM to offset the cost of this, we think that BRIM is insufficient to deal with this. Why is this so? Let's not talk about the people who are currently receiving BRIM. Given the high increased standard of living, given the nature of BRIM being that people below the poverty line will receive some form of welfare from the government, 500 ringgit, right? But we tell you this, the fact that the Malaysian government has not adjusted the poverty line upwards to provide more people with bread, which in itself is ineffective to begin with, right? This harms the people. Why? Because initially someone earning 2,000 ringgit a month will no longer be able to afford the same goods he used to, because that 2,000 ringgit, given the cost-push inflation, has now severely diminished the spending power of this individual. What this means is that most goods that this person used to be able to afford are no longer affordable. Things like basic necessities. What does this mean? When people, not only, when we think that firstly, even if you can cover basic necessities, you have no other room. The amount, the ability of people to save, and this is another example, right? The ability of people to save in terms of rainy days has gone. Their only assurance and reliance is on the Malaysian government to provide them with that. And I'll tell you after this POI why that doesn't happen, and this assurance that is in place is not present. But before that, yes, closing.
During the recent oil price hike, the Prime Minister said that the GST would not be targeted into vital goods and local brands. This means that these goods are accessible by the large amount of public. Why is that a problem then?
The reason why it's a problem, Mr. Speaker, is because the cost of producing these goods is not merely extracting them and distributing them to the public. Transportation, other forms, other factors of production have to go into the good to ensure that the end user receives it. This means that his POI means that only the cost of extracting the good won't go up, but we tell you along the way, many other things will be taxed and charged, and this will in the end unfairly burden the consumer despite the government's insistence that it won't. All right, second level analysis, right? Third level analysis. Okay, let's talk about how employers are more to lay off workers. Now, given the profit motive of most companies and corporations, we think that employees are now incentivized to A, hire less workers, or B, pay them less. When we say hire less workers, we also mean, of course, that there's more incentive for current workers to be laid off. Because we think that ultimately, given a heightened cost of production, and given that companies do not want their profit to be diminished, we think that this means that companies will try to cut costs in any way possible. And we think that this unfairly targets, the middle and low income people, because these are the people who are most likely to have their incomes reduced and to be laid off in the first place. This means that more people fall under this poverty line, more people need the government assistance, but are not likely to receive it, given that Malaysia has no form of employment benefit whatsoever. We think that this is no thank you. Given that this means that more people are pushed to the lower, middle, and the low income people. This is the group that GST harms the most, and the government solution of it is insufficient to deal with it. But also, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that the reason why the increased cost of living is so terrible, right? Because we tell you the salary rise that in other developed countries is the salary that Malaysia has done, the government has done nothing to offset the cost of the people, this group of GST. How is this so? In other developed countries who already implement GST, such as Singapore, we tell you that what Singapore did when the GST was implemented was they ensured that there was a proportionate pay rise of the people, a proportionate spending power increase in the populace to ensure that these people are not sufficiently harmed. That is how they said revenue will go up and revenue will be maximized. But Malaysian government has done nothing of this sort. Malaysian government has only cut income tax by 1%. They think it's a lot, they think it's enough, but what's the tangible, the tangible effect of 1% on you as a middle to low income worker to begin with? And given that the tax rate the tax bracket in Malaysia is around 2,500, right? We think that most people who are harmed don't even pay tax to begin with. That this means that the benefit that they speak of doesn't exist at all. But also, Mr. Speaker, what does this mean? Right? Okay, what's the trade-off in this case? What can the state do with the money? What is Opp likely to argue that the state, that the benefits that they talk about of GST? Given that the implementation is costly, right, Mr. Speaker, and that's been the Malaysian government's primary argument in implementing GST, that well, the government doesn't profit so much from the tax dollars, and so, well, it should be implemented anyway. But the Malaysian government has considered themselves in their own mechanism proposal that the implementation of GST is extremely expensive, and the revenue they receive is only 900 million ringgit, plus minus around 900 million ringgit. What this means is that the tangible benefits that the government is supposed to accrue from this are not being accrued at the end of the day. So you have so much harm to these people. You have so many people struggling to make a living, forking out money they cannot afford to fork out, and the Malaysian government not even receiving the sort of benefit that they're going to talk about in the first place. The Malaysian government won't receive the full benefit of the GST, and therefore won't be able to channel that money, like they might argue, into other programs which may develop the infrastructure of the country. This doesn't happen at all because the Malaysian government has said the cost of implementation is so high. Mr. Speaker, for all those reasons, right, we protect the lower and middle income class, the lower and middle income class in Malaysia. We don't want to see them harmed. We don't think they should be forced into a situation where they have no other means to defend themselves and afford basic necessities, because that itself is a human right. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now
In today's debate, Mr. Speaker, we need to consider the sort of long-term benefits that we will gain versus the short-term harms that we will get from introducing GST. Because what the government refuses to see is that from the sort of implementation of GST, this has long-term benefits that we will gain from in the end. Yes, we accept that possibly certain people will be harmed. No, even if, certainly. But before I go on to that, to rebutting the opening government, let me talk to you about what the end goal of opening opposition is today. We tell you that we want to think of the long-term benefits because we see that this eventually helps engineer the industry trade in the future. We tell you that this eventually will benefit the people in the future. But first, rebutting the opening government, right? They tell you about this value-added tax and the indiscriminate prices and that there is no benefit to the people whatsoever. We tell you that this is extremely untrue because even with the implementation of GST, as we read in the budget, right, that the government received over 10 million profit for this, yet they subsidize the people that they only gain over 2 million profit, right? So we don't see the sort of harms that come from this sort of things because they already consider the plights of the people and try not to tax them as much as they can. But we tell you that even with the profits from this 2 million will also go into benefiting the people. And then they also want to tell you about GST not covering the basic consumables, and even if they do, their transportation costs will still. We tell you that this sort of, like, number one, the first response to that is GST does cover this basic. We're not taxing noodles, we're not taxing fruits, we're not taxing certain vegetables, things that people can afford, right? So this one of these basic people that these people basically need in poverty, who can't afford these sort of things, can still afford them under the new GST. We also second tell you that they want to talk about transportation costs will add to all these values. We tell you that those harms are still available under the services tax that we currently have because we're vulnerable to oil prices, we're vulnerable when they increase. So those sort of things, what happens is still increases under the fare, at least under ours it will not because GST is a flat tax rate of 6%, which I want to point out is the lowest in all ASEAN countries. Secondly, we tell you about we tell you that the government about instant gratification, right? We tell you that we benefit in the future because it's not just about companies getting 3% lower tax. Individuals get between 1 to 3%. It's not only 1%, right? We tell you that even under the new budget, more individuals are not taxed because the government increased somewhere about 6,000 to not be taxed under the new budget. So we tell you that these harms are already mitigated under our side. But first, now I'm going to my first point about how it benefits the people, right? Under status quo, these services tax are not standardized. Some people get charged 6%, some people charge 10%, etc. So we see that people that you want to talk about, the lowest common denominator, are sometimes taxed unfairly. And we want to talk about these different taxes burdens the middle classes, right? Because let's take an example that all of you will be familiar with, right? A 7-Eleven that's open 24 hours a day charges more for a packet of M&Ms than other grocery stores. These are the sort of things that happens under your paradigm because these services that these shops provide, they feel that they can charge more to the people. But under our paradigm, we remove that barrier, right? Because we don't allow you to charge extra under the GST. We tell you that this is something that my second speaker will talk more about, how industries won't increase prices indiscriminately, right? And we tell you that this is extremely important to recognize because this won't lead to bad services, right? Because let's talk about America, for example, of how they practice the culture of tipping. Right, and then what happens is the waiters and waitresses often offer bad services to other people because of the sort, like they see, okay, this person will probably pay me more, therefore I will serve these people better. And when they see someone who probably won't be able to, they treat these people worse. And we tell you that this won't happen under ours because GST is a flat rate. So industries will be able to serve them to do your best. And what happens is we do our best and we compete fairly. Because what happens under our paradigm is that there will be a standardized prices for these goods and services. And we tell you that because the government still removes GST from basic consumables, And that these, because often what this happens with these basic commodities is, right, they're extremely vulnerable to a hike in prices, especially during peak seasons, where this is extremely important in Malaysia, right, where we have Deepavali, where we have Hari Raya Korban, we have Hari Raya Aidilfitri, all these basic consumables increase in prices. Even though the government tries to mitigate them because people feel that they can charge more for these services, charge more for these goods during these peak seasons. We tell you, with GST, we prevent those sort of harms, because now grocers cannot tax industry because they are flat rate of tax. So people, when it happens is under the normal services tax, people often buy and leave themselves in worse positions. But before I go on, yes.
This is essentially in your case, because you just said that basic necessities are exempted from tax, but then you're suddenly saying that individuals will be exploited based on these basic necessities.
Yes, I'm telling you that because now we don't tax them for these basic consumables, people are not vulnerable to the price hikes that happens under the current sales and services tax that you are implementing, ladies and gentlemen. So what have I told you today, right? We tell you that under current status quo, with the unstandardized services tax, people are taxed 6 to 10%, and they are taxed unfairly. So we tell you that with GST, with a flat tax rate, we no longer burden the middle classes, we no longer burden the lower classes, because these basic commodities are no longer taxed. And we tell you that at the end of the day, what we want is to benefit those people in the long term. We benefit, even though they may have some sort of harms currently. For that, we are proud to oppose.
I'd like the leader of opposition, and I'd like to invite them to right.
Mr. Speaker, in the neighborhood, Madam Chair, in the neighborhood that I come from, 3 blocks down 7-Eleven, there is a 99 speed market. So what happens when people can't afford 7-Eleven, they go to 99 speed market. And that's the beauty of capitalism, right? When a certain company is going to want to charge you more for a certain product, you go to another company and buy their product, because that's where competitive atmospheres brings down prices. But we don't think GST allows this atmosphere to exist. What I'm going to talk to you in positive materials debate is how this harms the Malaysian economy in general, given the fact that it's less profitable for companies to come in and enjoy a populace that has spending power in the first place. But before that, a couple of responses. Now, before I move on to opening opposition, I want to just quickly deal with that POI. Because like Glosing Opp asks, does the exclusion from petroleum from GST mitigate the issue, right? This isn't true, Madam Chair. The reason being because GST is also a service tax. That means the transport cost in itself, the packaging cost in itself, all will be taxed under the GST. This means companies that outsource their products or the factors of production to other companies, for example, the packaging costs, the transporting companies, these companies will want to increase their cost of services as well because of the GST. That's why cost of production for goods go up at the same time, Madam Chair. We don't think petroleum just mitigates the problem. But in addition to that, they just told us the Malaysian government shows no security in the price of oil whatsoever, Madam Chair. So even if you put GST, you're not saying, because recently the price of oil went up, right? So there's really no security, because even if the price of oil goes up, then people are screwed anyways. So we don't think the exclusion of petroleum necessarily protects people at this instance. So let's deal with side opening opposition, right? They told us, well, no thank you. They told us that GST does not tax basic necessities like food and rice. Yes, but what happens, Madam Chair, is in your best case scenario. This is why they needed to engage with my Prime Minister's arguments, right? We told you, given the supply chain in itself and that leading to the prices of these goods going up, the best case scenario in your situation is like goods like fruit and rice will remain the same price, because those will be offsetted by the price of the GST going up in itself. all other goods under your scenario will be going up in price at the end of the day. Because that is why in the Malaysian 2015 budget, the government projected more revenue from GST than SST, Madam Chair, because they are showing that they will make more profit from GST. And the reason, the analysis Sebastian gave in his speech, and this is going to be useless because the government has already said the implementation cost of GST itself is going to be overpriced for them. In those instances, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that that money can be transferred to other necessities in general, right? But secondly, they told us, but I've already told you, right, how some companies won't want, if some companies do hike prices, people will naturally go to other shops to buy cheaper products, and this keeps the prices low. But then the question becomes, do companies charge at different rate in status quo? That means meaning their service charge. Because their argument was that companies have different service charge rates, and that is highly inconsistent. The first response is, of course, if they have a higher service charge, Mr. Speaker, it's not in their incentive to do so because people will not buy their products. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, it is pretty standard right now, right? Because service charge is generally 10% and government charge is 6% in this instance. Those things are generally standard because companies realize that charging more will pretty much just screw them over. People won't come to their shops in the first place and they'll consider it to be ridiculous. But before I move on to my arguments, yes, sir.
There's a current problem with the way national revenue operates, because we struggle with a huge national deficit that exists. That's what warrants for a new taxation system. Given there's a problem with the national budget and its deficit, what is your solution?
Okay, let's talk about the national budget. This is where my argument will directly clash with that question, right? Because how does this harm the Malaysian economy? We think how companies work with Madam Chair, especially multinational corporations that want to invest in your country. For example, foreign direct investments, right? It's contingent upon the spending power of your people in itself. If your spending power of the people is dramatically reduced because of GST, this means countries are less interested in investing their products in a certain country because people won't buy your products since it's considered not a necessity and maybe a luxury in those instances. People are generally demotivated to spend more, and given that they can't even save more, Mr. Speaker, we don't think investors will be interested. This is the same reason why in Greece, Mr. Speaker, when during the austerity measures, the government decided to cut pension spending. This Standard & Poor's, the credit rating company, immediately reduced the credit rating of Greece because people were not able to spend as much and the spending powers dramatically decreased. That's why foreign direct investment is directly demotivated because individuals have no confidence in spending money in your country itself. What does this mean? This means, Mr. Speaker, the ability for your country to gain economic prosperity from foreign direct investments, from investments from other countries, and therefore build your national revenue itself decreases. On a trade-off, this means your GST is not going to help the people in your country. Your GST is also not going to help. The Malaysian economy in general, given the fact that you will see probably countries pulling out, especially small medium enterprises, right, pulling out from the system because people can't afford to spend money on other luxury goods as well. But let's hear your extension.
Yeah, when I asked about your deficit, your response was investment will be pulled out. But that does not answer the question of how will we improve the ability of government to get more money to serve the people.
Okay, let's talk about this more money because we already answered the question in Prime Minister's speech twice. Let's talk about this, Mr. Speaker. Because what the government projected was for currently in SST, there's about 7 billion ringgit in tax revenue or so on and so forth. And in GST, there'll be about 17 billion tax revenue, Mr. Speaker. What this means, Mr. Speaker, firstly, that extra tax revenue has already been explained to you as how it goes into the idea of implementation itself, because somehow or other Malaysian government, given their transparency, everything costs a bit more expensive than usual. AES cameras probably cost 10% or 100% more than its actual price. This means the government, and given its transparency level, always means that the implementation process that the government is going to take into placing the GST itself is going to be that price in some, Mr. Speaker. So what you're going to get maybe is a marginal profit in terms of the additional revenue that the government is going to get, since they've already spent some portion of it on implementation. What does this mean? That, in addition to the fact that you now disencourage investors from coming in, that means that the government is going to make a deficit as opposed to a profit, Mr. Speaker, since they won't have. No, it's not here. It's here. Yeah. Since they won't have enough money to actually sustain the economy in the first place. For all those reasons, we don't think that the GST will be helping the people. We don't think that GST will be helping the country. We are very, very proud to propose this motion.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And again, first half of the I invite
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, while the government projected over $10 million ringgit in profit, the government also subsidizes us to the point where they're only getting a fifth of it. So people are not affected unlike what they've been trying to claim under this side of the house. Nitya has already talked to you about how GST has benefited the people, and I will extend on this, but I'll also talk to you about how GST benefits not only local industry, but also how GST attracts foreign investment and how this would be good for our country. But first, let's attack the case that the government has brought up. First of all, Prime Minister came up and said that this will harm people below the poverty line. But as we all know, GST doesn't affect basic necessities. So no matter what happens, people can still survive. People that living under minimum wage, living at minimum wage can still survive because they have the basic necessities required to carry out the daily operations of living. So this harm doesn't exist, unlike what government has been trying to talk to you about. Secondly, they talked about how employers are incentivized to lay off more workers because GST affects their ability to create profits. This is completely false because when we see that under GST, companies have lower production costs. And when they have lower production costs, they develop a lust to expand. And when they expand, they are going to need to hire more people. So unlike what they say, they said that while the employers are incentivized to lay off more workers, we say this is completely wrong because when companies expand, they're going to hire more workers. So this is going to increase employability. And this is a very good thing for a developing nation like Malaysia. And thirdly, they talked about what the problem I have with them is how it's less profitable for companies to come in. But this is simply not true because under GST, companies can claim back that 6% tax from the government. And this not only, this helps them to have a higher profit margin. And I'm going to further elaborate this on my points, how having this higher profit margin is good for developing industries in Malaysia. So the harms, even if they do exist under their side of the house, is completely mitigated when compared to the extra profits gained by the Malaysian government, which can later be channeled into better institutions, can be channeled into better benefits for the people. Because as we know, Malaysia is suffering from a deficit. We have a problem with our budget, and the GST is the best solution that we can come up with to tackle this issue. So what has Nitya already told you about? She's talked to you about how the GST benefits people in the long run because and those benefits are long-term because the flat tax rate removes the burden on the middle class by removing indiscriminate pricing to start with. And also very importantly, she stressed that the GST does not apply to all goods and services, meaning that basic consumables are still free from this extra layer of tax and people are still able to survive on minimum wage. Now, before I move on to my own point, 2 points. I'll talk to you about how this benefits local industry and how this benefits foreign investment. Closing.
To be very clear, so smart people pay less tax because of the various taxes that are getting, or people pay more tax at the end of the day.
What I'm trying to say is that under the GST, the Malaysian government has a problem with deficit, but they are trying to solve this problem in the best way possible. And we believe that even if some people end up paying more tax, that the tax will ultimately benefit the country. And when the Malaysian government has more profits, the country does better because the government is better able to provide for the people. This is the stance that we are taking on Opposition House. Moving on to my first point, I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of local industry because under GST, there's a reduced cost of production. Now, why is this good? Because this helps industries in developing nations such as Malaysia to keep costs low. What happens when they are able to keep costs low in a developing country like Malaysia? This gives them the time they need to grow organically. Because what we see when companies are put under unfair pressure at the early stages of development, they do things, they come up with practices that are not necessarily good to companies and people, like they cut corners, they reduce spending in areas where they shouldn't, they reduce spending in research and development. So what we say is that when this reduces cost to production, this helps industries, local industries, to develop at a pace that is organic, meaning that they can now grow organically, they can grow and not compromise on quality, they don't compromise on safety, and they don't compromise on benefits to the people when it comes to designing and selling and manufacturing their products. Now, on the other level, what happens when companies in Malaysia, under this reduced cost of production, they're able to make bigger profits and thus they can be taxed more. And when they are taxed more, and he talked about while costs of implementation are high, the profits are how the government implements GST in the first place. So when governments can tax companies more or receive more tax from companies, the government can better serve the people. They are now better able to channel more money into public institutions. They're better able to channel more money into public hospitals, into public housing, into better schooling for the people. And this directly this directly strengthens the case brought up by Nitya, how the GST benefits the people. But also let's talk about how GST attracts foreign investment, because we see that our government's goods and services tax in Malaysia is the lowest in ASEAN at 6%. This means that foreign investment is attracted to investing in Malaysia. And what happens when we have more foreign investment? First of all, we are better able to compete with our ASEAN neighbors because we have greater foreign investment, and thus, we have greater foreign investment, and thus we are better able to provide employability. We increase throughput by providing more jobs, because when more companies come in, there's more opportunities for people to get employed, more opportunities for unskilled, semi-skilled, even professional workers to gain employability. And when employability is high, people are better able to support their families. And this ultimately encourages economic growth, because when foreign companies comes in, this also drives the government to build better facilities, better infrastructures, to develop people so that they're better able to work under foreign companies, and also better facilities and infrastructure to support both local industry and now foreign inclusion into the economy. And so what has opposition told you in this debate? We've talked to you about how the GST has long-term benefits, and these long-term benefits extend to both the people, to local industry, and to the economy of Malaysia as a whole. And for all of these reasons, we are very proud to tell you that the GST is a good solution that the Malaysian government has come up with to solving our current debt issue, current deficit issues. Your thoughts?
If you look at it seems very noble. They want to make hospitals better, they want to make schools better. But we don't think that a policy accrues the kind of benefits that you want, because you're sacrificing individuals that are the majority in this country, which are from the lower income bracket, Mr. Speaker. Because in their speech, they told you that this is an all across the board taxation that occurs irrespective of the kind of participation that you have in the economy. That means the students that don't have continuous, consistent primary source of capital cannot mitigate the kind of extra financial burden that is imposed onto them. That means when you go to 7-Eleven to buy a Maggi hot cup, it becomes more expensive to students. That means it makes it more likely that it's harmful to these particular individuals, right? We don't think that the development of your economy should be at the expense of your individuals. Because when you look at the current taxation system that already exists in Malaysia, things like income taxes, the reason why we're okay with those particular things is because it takes into consideration the kind of contribution that you make to the economy, as well as the kind of contribution that you can give to the ability, to your best ability as a particular individual. Will this be a sustainable avenue to address the deficit? We don't think so. Because irrespective, no thank you, of the percentage of the tax that the governments can give, is still dependent upon the fact of individuals' participation in terms of accruing that revenue to begin with. The projection under that side of the house is dependent upon the citizens' current spending. And we think that in this particular scenario, the GST more often than not limits the ability to participate. That means that the revenue that you want don't accrue as well. There's a tension inside opening government, because inside opening opposition, because the leader of Opp told you there's less taxation because of indiscriminate taxation, but in DLO, he told you now we'll suddenly have more revenue. We don't see where the link applies in this particular debate, right? We also don't think that the GST will help all humans, because the premise is that we can always lower taxation to help individuals. We reject the characterization inside opening opposition that basic goods as of right now are expensive, because we think that A, basic necessities are already subsidized by the states. That means we already protect individuals as it is. If you see in the state trying to increase the prices of sugar, the society goes crazy because they don't understand why is it basic necessities needs to be protected under this particular scenario. No, thank you. Under your model, the supermarkets can still charge individuals a higher prices because the cost in which they want to provide their service in that particular scenario can still be expensive. We think that the kind of participation in terms of foreign direct investment, there's no incentive. Why? Because when you have foreign direct investments and companies wanting to build up or create a market in a particular developing nation, especially in Malaysia, when you don't have a market to opt into buying your goods, what's the incentive to want to create foreign direct investments within this particular state? Let's look at the differentiation with closing government and opening government, because we think that they did an adequate job in assessing on how you harm the lower income bracket and how you decrease purchasing power. We'll tell you on closing government why you harm businesses on all spectrums, as well as how you entrench the participation of individuals, because you tell them that the way in which you can participate in a community because you're of a lower income bracket is only because of basic necessities and how that harms individuals. Before I move on, sure.
This is the Google Nexus. I pay 1,400 ringgit and I help Google. I pay a marginal amount of tax to the government. Tell me how the government benefits from my purchase of foreign products continuously and continuously.
I don't understand A, why you need to show your phone. We don't think that's a very good phone to begin with. But secondly, we also have to consider, Madam Chair, the kind of individuals that can buy phones like Max are not individuals of the lower income bracket. They can participate in buying things like goods and services. In this particular scenario, individuals that want to buy a phone or want to buy a car because they want to participate in the economy becomes less able in participation. I'll deal with that more in my extension. Firstly, why it's detrimental to businesses in Malaysia? Let's look at the incentive to participate in the local market, right? Because we think we have a diverse market as is a Firstly, let's look at small to medium enterprises, because we have to accept the fact that the majority of individuals within the country are individuals of the lower income bracket. We think that in this particular scenario, when you have a GST that taxes consumers, and it's wide knowledge, right, that consumers know that at the end of the day, they still have to bear a large operational cost in terms of the goods and services that they take. But we think that in this particular scenario, small to medium enterprises can't accrue profit immediately. Where do we think this applies? Businesses that are of the cultural sectors, businesses that are of the specialized sectors. We're talking about your Mak Lima in Terengganu that are making wows and curries in terms of trying to attract customers into buying that particular good, right? We think that in this particular scenario, no thank you, the ability for an individual to participate because of the taxation that applies means that there's no incentive whatsoever to buy those particular cultural goods. While we understand that individuals within capital cities, no thank you, like Kuala Lumpur or Johor Bahru close to Singapore, might thrive on this ability to attract customers. We think that in other aspects or in other states within Malaysia, you don't have the ability to help or assist individuals in this particular manner. No, thank you. We also think that in this scenario, more often than not, you victimize individuals who are already of the lower income bracket, but be trying to accrue profit, but makes it a lot harder because you say that it has to be all across the board, right? Secondly, we also think that the kind of benefit that you also cannot benefit a larger business. We think that larger businesses will capitalize on this because the deputy leader of opposition made this assertion that it lowers production costs. But we think that when you make goods in status quo without the implementation of the GST, that you're liable to the kind of purchases that you make in terms of your raw material. That means that companies more often than not make an active effort to buy materials that are most cost effective in terms of balancing it out with the kind of profit that they can accrue and as well as the operational costs that they can have. But when you implement the GST, especially in Malaysia, there is no regard to the kind of decision making in terms of the cost benefit analysis in buying those particular materials. We think that in this scenario, the operational cost that is borne by the consumers is something that companies will more often than not take advantage of and not buy material that is cost effective to individuals. We think that in this scenario, the goods and services that you have in Malaysia will increase in prices and limit the ability for individuals to participate and allow for capitalization and exploitation to exist. We think that as it is, we think that the upper middle income bracket will be able to survive in this particular scenario because they have access to all of these other things. Let's look at examples where countries don't employ a a form of goods and services tax, right? In Europe, the reason why the Middle Easterners and other people like to go and shop there, because the GST is redeemable at the end of the day, because it's lucrative and it's attractive, right? In this particular scenario, we think that this is when individuals will more likely than not participate. But lastly, it entrenches the participation of the lower income bracket within the development economy, because you say that these individuals only can participate when it's about basic necessities, and that's good enough for you. We think that sometimes the lower income brackets don't always survive on things like flour, but it also depends on things like services, especially individuals who, for example, have to work more than one job and have to get food fast in order to feed their family, Mr. Speaker. We think that it relies on the fact that there's a service industry that can provide for them. If you feel that individuals will be harmed, especially the majority, you should propose this motion.
Can I start? I'm sorry, but the context of the debate needs to move on further than 7-Eleven and M&M's. The first one to identify the problem will be closing opposition, because a chunk of response the government made was not on opening opposition cases, but was from POI. Let's tell you what is the problem in the Malaysian economy in status quo. We are facing a national deficit. That's why we're moving out from the 2013 budget into the 2014 budget. This national deficit affected us so much that we couldn't even subsidize things like petrol. But interestingly, if you look at spending pattern, consumer purchases are so vibrant in this economy. And if you look, for example, even in cars, every month, Malaysians buy about 40,000 cars. That's why the number plates are improving very fast. People's spending pattern, ladies and gentlemen, have not benefited in this country. That's why we have implemented this GST. Closing opposition will be the first one to tell you, why does the GST target the right group of people? My second extension is, why does the GST target the right type of commodities and protect local economy and local industries, right? Thirdly, what is the necessity of improving the tax system? But before that, clarify a few that this debate or a lot of intermediary 6% is a huge cost. But they never really told you why this cost would be so huge until people either will be affected so much that I will literally die when I buy my Honda Civic. No. The reason why I buy a Honda Civic is because I can afford to pay the price, and the price difference that it is with a MIDP, right? And that's why individuals can do that. It does not affect them. And then they went on to argue, look, even if they have money, when we collect money, we have BRIM, that's a bit inefficient. That means you are not opposing to the tax collection service, which this debate requires you to argue about. You're just opposed to BRIM. And in fact, we are also not happy with BRIM. But we're happy with GST and the way it collects tax, ladies and gentlemen, right? And then when asked about deficit, he told us that you will affect investment. I think, ladies and gentlemen, opening government struggles with this idea called respond, because they just throw in words to assume they can run away with stuff. But I think closing government, ladies and gentlemen, dealt with some interesting idea. This has been said, sir. Right? They first talked about like how you increase large operational costs for people in status quo. No shit, Sherlock. Everyone will suffer an increase in price. The debate is about whether the increase is justified or not. I will deal with the idea about SMEs in my personal substantiation later. But they assume, ladies and gentlemen, that all prices will be hiked, and that's false, because the GST targets not vital goods. For example, food like rice and everything, that's not targeted. It also does not target, and this is the important part, local goods. That's why with negotiation with the Malaysian automotive industry, they've also gone to exclude people like Produa and Proton in order to protect local brands. And then she says that this, we will limit participation of people in the economy. That's wrong, because people in Malaysia have not prioritized local goods, have not spent in a way that helps the government, ladies and gentlemen. I will settle all of these issues that brought up by my government bench in my substantive even more clearly. Number one, why does GST target the right people or the right group? Because currently, ladies and gentlemen, it does not unfairly burden the society because we only target luxury goods or foreign goods. Mind you, ladies and gentlemen, you can live without this Honda Civic. Mind you, Malaysia local products are so extensive, there is a reasonable alternative for everything that you can see in this world, ladies and gentlemen. In Malaysia, for example, phones, clothes, even in fact cars, ladies and gentlemen, right? That's why we are taxing the individual who can afford to pay the price difference, and we're not targeting the most vulnerable group, and this is why it's important. And the most important part in non-vital goods, right? When I asked this POI, his response was, yes, we have transportation costs. The problem is when transportation, you use people like FedEx and DHL to do your transportation. That's why it increases your cost. Among the caveats that GST also protects are small business, small local businesses as well. Businesses have not reached a turnover of 1 million or 2 million will be exempted from this tax. So what will we incentivize? We will incentivize all this company to use local distributors or small distributors, ladies and gentlemen, to save costs. That's why we take money from the people who can afford to give money, and we don't hurt the people who cannot give money, right? Under your paradigm, people will have to incur costs indiscriminately, and they will have to suffer from the lack of infrastructure that exists, ladies and gentlemen. Why is this important? Because the government needs to operate the welfare infrastructure based on the tax money that it has. And I'll explain this idea further on, but infrastructure, ladies and gentlemen, hurts the most vulnerable people who depend on this infrastructure. Tell me, how are you going to answer these people, especially when your turnover is 7 million and does not answer to things like oil prices or whatever. But before I move on, I'll take one from closing.
The premise of your exception is false, because you're saying that GST only targets things like luxurious goods. But the fact of the matter is it targets all services, things like a restaurant, that's a GST.
Hey, Macha, no. GST targets only certain goods. That's why we are a protectionist economy. We want to make sure when people spend on foreign goods, they pay the adequate amount of services. When you buy Proton, that's why GST is exempted from Proton. This nicely leads to my second extension. Well, what types of commodities are we dealing with? Ladies and gentlemen, mind you that the GST does not target local goods. This means that the local alternatives like Proton and whatever not are accessible comparative good that people can go to, because in status quo people don't really trust local goods that much. That's why people don't mind buying Apple. People don't mind buying Honda Civic Lights because they want to spend on those goods. The reason why Malaysia is much more viable for this policy to be practiced in comparison with Singapore is because Malaysia is a manufacturing economy. We manufacture a lot of goods, ladies and gentlemen. What do we do then? We encourage people to participate, ladies and gentlemen, and to buy local products. Then what does this mean? We create more job employment. We improve the local brand as a whole. The next idea is that you have to realize that GST does not also not target small business corporation. So what do we incentivize? We incentivize from small businesses to prop up, ladies and gentlemen. My last idea is that what is the necessity for government to improve the tax system? And this is where closing opposition will deal with an area of debate that's never been touched. Malaysia, everybody, keep quiet, guys. Malaysia is improving in its infrastructure. The MRT project and hospital, ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia faces infrastructural problem with welfare. That's why we need to increase the revenue pool, right? If, for example, why is this important? Because these are industries where you can create more and more job employment. MRT system means that you need a lot of people to run the operational cost. If you have more money, you can invest in other industry. The same way we move from oil and gas and we move into biotechnology. We have the ability to venture into different areas and areas to develop our economy. This, ladies and gentlemen, hugely benefits the people. That's why it's unfair for the government not to collect more money, especially when it affects the most vulnerable people. I'm very proud to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, in implementing tax everywhere, the policy has always been sensitive towards the people and how people are being able to financially react to that policy. That means a tax policy must always be reactive towards the citizens' needs. So we think that on side opposition, they have never been able to prove that this particular policy is reactive towards the people in Malaysia or their needs per se. So Jay told you several very important things in this debate that we need to remind the crowd of. Firstly, who you heard the most are people who don't belong in the sustainable income, which is the lower income bracket. On side opposition, what they presume is that the moment you allow basic necessities to be exempted, that means those people are protected. But what are the things that are considered basic necessity are only initial goods, things like rice and things like certain foods. So that means that people who are working and who are extremely busy, you presume that they always will be able to benefit from buying things like rice and buying things like those basic foods. So we think that you still highly marginalize those people who aren't able to access things like service. So those people are pushed away from service industries and all those other things that they need to access. Things like clothes, things like cooked food, things like books, stationery, all these things that they need for a meaningful life are things that are not exempted under GST, things that will still be increased and things that will still hurt those people. Secondly, she also told you how small business enterprises are limited by their ability because operational costs are now more expensive. Unlike large businesses who can immediately go towards manufacturers and things like that, small businesses usually get their products or all their other things from other businesses. That means that those businesses who are taxed now lead to the increased operational costs or for small businesses. So small businesses don't have now the ability or the freedom to operate within the Malaysian economy because of the restrictive tax and the increased amount of tax and operational costs towards that business. So thank you, sir. Furthermore, this is something very important that we think got very little response to. Jay told you that the attitude in which individuals react to tax is very important. We can see that even people within the higher income group will spend less within your country because of the increased amount of tax. Like for example, Jay's example was that foreigners from highly taxed nations will go to countries like Europe where tax are redeemable. Because even your rich individual will want to go to places where they can avoid tax. For heaven's sake, tax avoidance is a hobby for a lot of people. So people react to tax and people will spend less in your nation if you tax a lot more. No, thank you. So therefore, this comes to the conclusion that the entire op bench presume that just because you implement GST, that means government will necessarily get more revenue without talking about how people react to GST and whether or not people still have sufficient buying power within the economy. No, thank you. With that, we think their case necessarily false. Yes, sir.
The same way we buy Ferrari in 3 years ago, when you bring it back to tax you, you can implement a policy for people to not evade. Then why is your argument about people tax evading will be legitimate?
Because initially when they buy Ferrari overseas, it'll be cheaper because the operational costs are not taxed in countries like Europe and things like that. So we don't understand why you want to implement another tax policy or such, right? Let's deal with the case coming from opening opposition first, right? Because in opening opposition, their case was very simple and there was a minor shift in their case. Because their first speaker was talking about actually we're taxing people less because of the less amount of tax that company can put on people. But then the second speaker wanted to talk about the benefits of taxing people more and the benefits of government revenue. So we think their shift in case essentially put them out of the debate. So let's now deal with closing. So what they wanted on closing was a sustainable avenue for you to address government deficit. What they don't realize was that the budget projection was based on the expected revenue, based on the current spending that people have. So what they needed to do was tell us why the current spending will continue to be the same when government recognized that there was also already a problem in the current spending. The reason why BRIM was given out was because people spend less in rural areas and people spend less in places like Johor and Kuantan. If you live in KL, you probably do not know that. But in Johor, malls closed down so much and a lot of shops closed down because people don't have money or ability to access those goods and people are cutting down on their ability to spend. No, thank you. So we think that in the future, the amount of tax that government will accrue will reduce. And this will never be able to address things like deficit and increase the amount of infrastructure that you can give to the people. So we think that before you want to prioritize things like building more KLIAs, as if 2 KLIAs is not enough, you need to prioritize the people on the ground and whether or not the most vulnerable are able to access the goods that they need and not excluded from the economy and only assume what they need are basic necessities. No, thank you. So what we also told you, no, thank you. So what we also told you is this, right? What will happen the moment you exclude people at lower income groups of only those basic necessities and whether or not you exclude them from the economy? When you exclude them from the economy, that means you're effectively reducing the potential of people from the lower income group to escape that particular place. That means that lower income group people will never be able to access and get the ability of power to buy things in the future. The more you increase the livelihood for them, the cost of livelihood for them, the harder it is for them to escape their line of poverty. Everything that's extremely, no, thank you. Everything that's extremely harmful, right? So in conclusion, we told you that the ability of government to accrue revenue isn't something that's ultimate on side opposition. They needed to prove trend of how people react to tax first in order to prove that government will immediately get benefit to address the deficit that's happening. Furthermore, they wanted things like protection on local goods, when there was clearly a lie. Not all local goods are protected under the GST. Only certain local goods like Proton. But if you think about it, Proton is a horrible example because like Mars, Proton have been the past few years. That means you're essentially protecting a company that's dying out, regardless of whether or not the company will be able to accrue benefit for the society or for the nation as a whole. That's why protectionist policy, one, is a different debate, but also a very bad thing to protect in the context of Malaysia, when protectionists have screwed us up with companies like Mars, especially in Malaysia. Protectionist policies don't necessarily work in the companies we choose to protect. So in conclusion, GST increased the tax that are chargeable across every service. That means that you limit the maximization of access for consumers towards these goods. Everything is reduced. The reduction of power towards the citizens of Malaysia is regrettable.
Madam Chair, I'm going to divide my speech into two parts. First, I'm going to tackle the ridiculous characterization of the 1970s Malaysia that came out of opening and closing, ridiculously poor, can't afford consumers' goods, and cannot afford the marginal increase in taxes that we are therefore providing to make up for the government deficit. Then I'm going to compare all of the harm that they tried to bring out with the benefit of receiving that money for the government and making up for that deficit, and why continuing on the path of racking up a government deficit and continuing to borrow and raising interest costs is going to be detrimental to society and detrimental to the future development and growth of the Malaysian economy, something they refuse to compare all their arguments against. First, they wanted to tell us straight from opening government that all goods and services are going to be double taxed because intermediate goods and services are going to be taxed as well. We say that is patently false because final goods are the ones that are going to be taxed, and we've been clear about that. But because even though like the production costs and services of like the final good is there, those taxes are exempt because the government knows it's going to be a form of double taxation, so that doesn't exist. But even if that does exist and you want to make a factual debate about that, we're perfectly fine, as you said, because BRIM has obviously increased in order to make up for like the essential goods, for example, that people must buy. BRIM has increased. The poverty line that they openly want to talk about can be also increased so that more people qualify for it, so that they can buy those essential goods. So we don't think that's necessarily part of the debate. You haven't engaged gauge on the necessity for the tax, given that the majority of the country can't afford to pay it. This goes back a little bit to closing as well, because closing wanted to make it seem as that people are no longer going to buy any sort of goods as well, because nobody can afford to buy anything. So people are going to now travel to Europe to buy a car. If you can afford to go to Europe, you can afford to pay a couple of more dollars for your nasi lemak. We don't think that's something harmful in the long run. But most people in society, have a seat, guys, are middle income, meaning they can't afford to pay $10,000 to go to Europe, but they can afford to pay a couple extra dollars for the nasi lemak or for the luxury goods and services that they buy on a daily basis, or for the services that they use in the economy. Given that SMEs have been growing in the economy, up at a rate 60% of the GDP comes from these SMEs that are growing at an increasing rate. This is something that people can afford because they make money from it. Have a seat. Now, let's talk about MNCs, for example, and how they depend on purchasing power, because both opening and closing wanted to make this a critical part of this debate. They told us that MNCs will no longer be able to operate in this country because now people with less purchasing power will no longer purchase their goods. First, we never heard any comparative to the interest rates that will go up that Max talked to you about when the government continues to borrow at a higher rate and deficit, meaning that MNCs and even local businesses can no longer borrow and get the financing they need to even enter the market into the first place to develop. We think that's something that's harmful. But secondly, MNCs that are already in the country are not going to pack up and leave because we've increased GST just a little bit. Those companies still make a lot of profit, given that consumer spending is continuing to rise in this economy. The entire reason the government instituted the GST is because they saw this is an area of continued economic growth within Malaysia, meaning that it can be sustained, even if to a certain extent, yes, people do have to pay more prices. That's part of what taxes are. Have a seat. So yes, there will be like a slight dip in like the purchases they made, but these companies will still be profitable, will still be hiring and expanding, although maybe at a slower rate, and will still be hiring people. We don't see the mass layoffs and recessions that they want to talk about. Don't worry, guys, McDonald's will still be here. Now, let's talk about, like, finally in closing, they also want to talk about like how SMEs now, like people with lower income, will no longer be able to like sell their cultural goods. Here's the thing. SMEs of a certain size are the ones that are going to be taxed with the GST. So smaller SMEs, for example, that make less than I believe like 500,000 in revenue per year, those ones won't have the tax applied to them. So we don't think on the lower scale those revenue companies will actually be taxed, and we think they will still benefit from the market as well. Before I go on, opening.
So, if low income and middle income people in your policy will opt for tax exempt food like rice and fruits for the rest of their lives, where will get revenue to reduce?
To a certain amount, they will opt for those things, but we think people still want Western food. They still want to go to Chili's. People still want to buy lawyer services. People still want to purchase those things. So we still get the money from that. And yes, people will have to pay a higher cost, but because this is not the 1970s, people can actually afford it, and we don't think that's necessarily harmful to the economy. Let's talk about why we need to actually implement the GST and how the profit we get from it actually goes to tackling major problems in the development of Malaysia. Let's talk about that right now. So the reason why we need the GST is because of the ballooning government deficit that Max already told you about. What this means is that as this deficit increases, Malaysia's government has to borrow and borrow increasingly more on the market. This raises the interest rates already, that has caused financing for small businesses and for companies that want to expand their business or even open up new operating shops. So lots of the stall that want to open up cannot afford to do so because interest rate and financing has gotten so out of control. But additionally, we see that when investors fear the ability of the government to pay back on its debts, this is when FDIs start coming into the country. This is when people start buying Malaysian government bonds, so the government cannot get the financing it needs in order to continue with spending. Now, the spending that we're talking about is critical spending on Malaysia's infrastructure, critical spending on Malaysia's development and economic growth. What are these things that we're talking about? First, we're talking about things like infrastructure development, like the MRT that we see being built, for example. These are things that will make travel more cheap for Malaysia in the future, make travel more efficient, and generally lower costs and increase the development of Malaysia in the future. But we see that if we don't have that, we also lose the jobs that come that the Malaysian government provides by developing that infrastructure and building those things in the first place. So we have an increase of unemployment in the economy because the government cannot afford to pay for those things as well. Before I go on closing.
The reason why there's no incentive to participate is because everyone across the board knows that consumers have to bear the operational costs. How does your side of the house gain the revenue, but people don't want to participate?
People do, but that's exactly the point, that consumer spending has continued to increase even after the GST has been implemented, and the government is making money off of it to make up for the shortfall and deficit. The problem with both houses is that they refuse to compare and contrast the harm and the increasing prices against the benefit the government has in being able to continue to pay for BRIM, for education expenses, for the university loans that you guys get in order to be able to afford to go to university in the first place. So future generations won't have that when the government cuts off its funding because it is not able to get the financing on the market it needs, because the deficit has ballooned to almost 100% of the GDP of the economy. These are the harms that will happen if we do not implement the GST. Opening also wanted to tell us that now, like, the cost of having the GST far outweigh the benefit that we have from it. We agree that maybe initially there are costs associated with implementing the GST as far as the bureaucracy is concerned, but later on, the employment that we get and the ability of the government to continue to borrow on the market and reassure investors to get that money and continue the development and continue Malaysia's economic growth at 5%, which it has been doing every year, is something that is critical to Malaysia's future growth, something that we do not want to sacrifice because you don't want to pay a couple extra dollars for nasi lemak.